We are starting section 4B on monetary policy and credit. And once again, I would like to thank you everyone for participating in this section. Today, we will have the pleasure to have the presentation for 3 papers. The first is the paper Heterogeneous Monetary Policy Pass-Through to Consumer Credit Among the Income Distribution, and will be presented by Antonia Tang from the University of Cambridge. And the second is the Digital Payments and Monetary Policy Transmission by Matheus Sampaio from Florida State University. And the third paper is the Heterogeneous Bank Lending Channel for Monetary Policy by George Abad from Banco da Espanha. Each presentation will last up to 20 minutes, and the discussion will have up to 10 minutes for his consideration. After that, we will have 10 minutes for a brief response from the author and for questions from the audience. Without further ado, please, Antonia, the floor is yours.
Hello. Oh, perfect. Great. So super happy to be here today to discuss heterogeneous monetary policy pass-through to consumer credit along the income distribution. So what this paper tries to answer is whether the pass-through of monetary policy to consumer credit varies across the income distribution. And what we do here is we make use of some very rich Brazilian loan level data from the credit registry to document that it looks like monetary policy disproportionately affects the interest rates of lower income individuals. In doing so, we think that this provides some empirical support for a potential new transmission mechanism from monetary policy to inequality through the cost of consumer credit. So we have 3 headline results. Firstly, we find that the pass-through of monetary policy to consumer credit rates is stronger for lower income borrowers. Secondly, we show that this result holds even when we compare like-for-like loan portfolios, so loans of the same type, volume, and maturity. An implication of this is that this heterogeneity and pass-through would still be present even if all borrowers held identical loan portfolios. Finally, we show that this pass-through heterogeneity is asymmetric. So while the pass-through of monetary policy hikes is stronger for low-income individuals, the pass-through of monetary policy cuts is weaker for lower-income individuals than higher earners. So taken together, we think that this suggests that the pass-through of monetary policy to consumer credit is heterogeneous, such that monetary policy might increase credit cost inequality across the income distribution. And again, we emphasize here that this isn't just because of differences in loan portfolio characteristics or individual characteristics, and it's not just because of differences in the composition of loan portfolios across the income distribution. Finally, if we have enough time, I'll talk a little bit about why we think that these results might be more consistent with being driven by supply-side changes rather than demand. So just very quickly on the literature, there's kind of a growing new empirical literature on the effect of monetary policy on inequality. And generally, this finds that monetary policy worsens inequality in general equilibrium. And so really the main contribution of our paper here is to examine the transmission mechanism from monetary policy to inequality through consumer credit. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the data that we use. So the main data source is the credit registry that's maintained here by the Central Bank of Brazil. And so this credit registry contains monthly loan level data on individual and loan characteristics. And so we're able to see the loan portfolios of every individual, as well as the characteristics associated with that individual and their loans, as well as which banks are lending to these individuals. We take a random sample that covers just over 3.7 million new loans made to just under 750,000 individuals between 2018 and the end of 2022. And we focus on individuals' portfolios of traditional non-housing loans. So by traditional, I really just mean we don't consider revolving credit types like credit cards or overdrafts. And so this covers 4 broad loan types. It covers payroll loans, personal loans, car loans, and goods loans. As income is central to our paper, we take 3 different measures of income. So we take the nominal value of monthly income, we take the income category of an individual, where the category is based on earnings as a multiple of the minimum wage, and we take the income percentile of an individual, where that income percentile is from the in-sample monthly cross-sectional distribution of income. So to investigate heterogeneity in monetary policy pass-through, we use an individual bank-level panel regression, where our dependent variable is the average nominal interest rate charged on new loans issued to an individual by a bank that lives in municipality M during month T. And our key coefficient here is this beta 1, which is the coefficient on the interaction between the policy rate, the SELIC, and income. So this tells you the correlation between pass-through and income. We include some loan and individual characteristic controls like age, gender, measures of financial inclusion, indebtedness, and risk. And we interact all these controls with the policy rate as well. And then finally, we also include municipality time, so location time, and bank time fixed effects. And we verify that our results are robust to a few different robustness checks. So we verify they're robust to different fixed effects, different cleaning measures, and we horse race the policy rate with inflation. So our first headline result is the pass-through of monetary policy is higher for lower income individuals. And we know this because we find that the coefficient on the interaction term between income and the policy rate is negative. So that suggests that a rise in the monetary policy rate is associated with a larger increase in interest rates for borrowers with lower incomes. So this table shows us our estimated beta 1 coefficient using our income and our income percentile variable. And so the thing really to note here is that both coefficients are significant and negative. In terms of magnitude, these coefficients suggest that for a 100 basis point hike in the policy rate, pass-through is about 32 bips lower for every additional 10,000 Brazilian real earned every month, or about 12 bips lower for every additional decile of the income distribution. This result also holds when we use our categorical variable. So here our reference category is the highest rate of income, so more than 20 multiples of minimum wage. And so what you can see here is that all other coefficients are positive and significant. So all other income categories see higher pass-through relative to the highest income category. If we plot these coefficients, we also see that the coefficient is higher for lower multiples of minimum wage. So it looks like this heterogeneity in pass-through is visible throughout the income distribution. And just as a reminder, we do control for a host of different loan and individual characteristics. So our results aren't just picking up things like differences in total indebtedness or an increase in default rates or proxying for things like relationship lending. So here we really do think that we're documenting an effect in consumer credit markets whereby the interest rates of lower income individuals are more responsive to the policy rate. So we then show that heterogeneity in pass-through can be because of a couple of different reasons. So firstly, it can be because of what we call portfolio composition effects. So maybe the composition of loan portfolios just differs across the income distribution and different loan types react differently to monetary policy. It could also be because of what we call a direct heterogeneity effect, where even when we're comparing like-for-like loans, that is loans of the same type, volume, and maturity, interest rates respond differently across the income distribution. And one implication of this direct heterogeneity effect is that pass-through would still be heterogeneous even if all individuals in Brazil held identical loan portfolios. So the way that we show this is that we note firstly that our beta-1 coefficient is the empirical approximation of the second derivative of an individual's interest rate with respect to the policy rate and income. And so when we take that derivative, we end up with three terms. And so that first term there is the direct heterogeneity effect. So this tells us that even within a loan type, there's still heterogeneity in pass-through. The second and the third term reflect portfolio composition effects. So this is the portion of heterogeneity in pass-through. That's because different income levels hold different proportions of different loan types. So empirically, we can test for this direct heterogeneity effect by restricting our sample by each loan type. And there, our beta-1 coefficient then directly corresponds to that direct heterogeneity effect term. And intuitively, that makes sense, because when you're restricting the sample by loan type, you're essentially switching off any loan portfolio composition effects because you condition on a loan of that type being made. And so that leads us to our second result, which is that the direct heterogeneity effect is operational. So we see heterogeneity in pass-through even when we're comparing like-for-like loans. And an implication of this is that pass-through heterogeneity would still exist even if everyone held identical loan portfolios. And we find that this is driven by payroll loans and personal loans, which are the two biggest consumer credit markets in Brazil. And finally, we use these coefficients and the shares to do a bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation. And we suggest that this direct heterogeneity channel accounts for between a third and a half of the overall pass-through heterogeneity that we estimate in result 1. So just to make it really clear how we know this, when we restrict the sample by loan type, we find that beta-1 is negative when we restrict it to personal or payroll loans. So this negative correlation between pass-through and income is seen even within loans of the same type. We don't find any clear heterogeneity in pass-through for auto or goods loans, which means that the overall direct heterogeneity effect across the different loan types is unequivocally negative. And so this suggests that heterogeneity in pass-through would still exist even if everyone held identical loan portfolios due to the presence of personal and payroll loans in the average person's loan portfolio. So this table shows us, again, our beta-1 coefficients, this time using the income percentile variable. But this holds when we use the continuous income variable, and it holds again when we use the categorical income variable. So here, column 1 shows us our estimated beta-1 coefficient from result 1. Column 2 shows us the estimated beta-1 coefficient when we restrict the sample to personal loans. And column 3 shows us the estimated beta-1 coefficient when we restrict the sample to payroll loans. So again, the important thing to note here is that all the coefficients are significant and negative. So we're still seeing this significantly negative correlation between pass-through and income. And again, payroll loans and personal loans are the two biggest consumer credit types in Brazil. And so using kind of the sample share of each loan type and our point estimates, we suggest that it accounts for between a third and a half of the estimated heterogeneity we present in result 1. So far we've seen that it looks like pass-through is heterogeneous across the income distribution such that lower income individuals are more exposed to the policy rate. But one of the reasons why we were kind of motivated to investigate this question and conduct this project is because we were interested in the distributional considerations of monetary policy. And here we notice that actually the distributional considerations of higher pass-through to lower income individuals is different across a monetary policy hike and a monetary policy cut. So although stronger pass-through of a monetary policy hike to lower income individuals might increase credit cost inequality, a stronger pass-through of interest rate cuts would alleviate credit cost inequality because you're reducing debt servicing costs more for lower income individuals. And so to kind of try and investigate these distributional considerations a little bit more. We amend our specification to allow for asymmetry in our beta 1 coefficient between the pre-COVID loosening cycle and the post-COVID hiking cycle that we observe in our sample period. And what we find is that heterogeneity in pass-through is asymmetric. So although credit rates for lower income borrowers rose by more in response to the policy rate hikes, it fell by less during the cutting period. So our beta 1 coefficient is negative during a hike, but positive during a cut. So, and then we conduct the same direct heterogeneity analysis, and we suggest that it's operational. And we estimate that it accounts for between 77 and 83% of the estimated weaker pass-through of cuts to low-income individuals, and again about a third to a half of the estimated stronger pass-through of hikes to lower-income individuals. So kind of taking this all together, this paper documents that the effect of monetary policy on consumer credit rates is heterogeneous across the income distribution. And it looks like it's heterogeneous in such a way that it might be worsening credit cost inequality. And we think this because of our three novel empirical results. So firstly, we show that monetary policy pass-through is stronger for lower income individuals, and we emphasize that this is not because of differences in individual characteristics. We then show that this holds even if we compare like-for-like loans, and that an implication of this is that we would still see heterogeneity in pass-through even if all individuals held identical loan portfolios. Finally, we show that this pass-through heterogeneity is asymmetric across monetary policy contractions and expansions. So while lower-income individuals were more exposed to hikes, they were less exposed to cuts. And so altogether, we think that this provides some empirical support for a potential new transmission mechanism from monetary policy to inequality through consumer credit rates. So I'll just talk very briefly on why we think these results might be more consistent with being driven by supply than demand. So this follows a consistency argument rather than being well identified. But essentially what we think is that our regression specification explicitly controls for volume. So we control for the volume of individuals' new loan portfolios, and we control for the total indebtedness of an individual. Because we interact these controls with the policy rate, this means that the relationship between price and volume and credit is also allowed to vary with the policy rate. And so these increases in price are disproportionate to the change in volume, which we suggest is more consistent with the larger change in supply than demand, because price is moving by more than what volume would justify. Secondly, we see heterogeneity in pass-through kind of throughout the income distribution. So this means even at the top end of the income distribution of people earning really quite high income levels. And we see it also in easy access credit markets like payroll loans. And so here it seems a little bit less unlikely that these results can be driven by surges in demand from maybe credit constrained individuals or individuals who desperately need credit for liquidity. Finally, we suggest that our asymmetry results are also more consistent with supply-side explanations. If you just think about why individuals might be demanding more credit, asymmetry doesn't quite square with maybe the pro-cyclical nature, with the counter-cyclical nature of income inequality. And so here we kind of tentatively suggest that maybe it's bank lending behavior that's really driving this heterogeneity in pass-through. Okay, perfect. So that's all I prepared for today. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Antonia. To discuss this text, I call Matheus, please.
Como é que faz para ficar grande? F11? Desculpa. Sorry. So first of all, great presentation. Today I'll comment on Antonia's paper on heterogeneous monetary policy pass-through to consumer credit along the income distribution. And what the paper does is basically they ask how does monetary policy affect borrowers across income levels, right? They use very rich loans, loan level from Brazil, from the Credit Bureau, and from that they extract self-reported income data that banks collect, and they estimate the loan level monetary pass-through across the income. And what they find is that they find a stronger pass-through for low-income borrowers. So every time the central bank raises rates, banks will raise rates more to low-income individuals. They decompose this into direct and composition effects, basically distinguishing not only this happens because low-income people have different portfolios, but also within the same type of loan, low-income people see higher rates. And this asymmetry goes when the central bank raises rates and lower rates, right? This is rockets and feathers effect. When the central bank raises rates, the rates for poor people rises like a rocket, and when central bank decreases rates, it goes down like feathers. It goes down very slowly. So by both measures, low-income people are facing higher rates than high-income people. So I prepared some comments, and let's see if they make sense. I'm sorry if they don't. So in the identification front, we see that the main problem with the Credit Bureau data is that income data is poor, is self-reported. The authors do a lot of work. They try their best to work with that. One alternative to that data source would be to use HISE, which also faces a lot of troubles, but I believe it's better. So the authors could focus, instead of focusing the entire population of Brazil, they can focus on one type of individual, like formal workers, which we have HISE information, and also retirees or governmental employees. Also the time frame. So one of the advantages of the Credit Bureau data is that we have decades of data. So the time frames chosen by the paper conflicts with COVID. So part of the monetary policy decisions is based on macro factors like COVID, which can confound the results. So maybe the results, if you study in a period that doesn't have COVID, might not show up. So the authors could use other time frames to check for that information. Also, one thing that could be interesting to look at is about credit access. So the sampling of individuals that Antonia and others did is that they sample people, and correct me if I'm wrong, that did a loan during that period. So it would be interesting to sample from the population and see how credit access varies across income levels. And the other type of the identification strategies would be to look at also monetary policy surprises, which will be interesting. On the mechanism side, I think this is the most important question, is why is this happening? Because banks, on its essence, they're profit maximizing. They are not being biased against low-income people. They want to extract rents from low-income and high-income people. So they're probably not being, they're probably being efficient. It's just that maybe there is a higher risk of default between that is correlated with income. And one thing you can do is explore credit score variables. I believe the central bank doesn't have that, but Serasa works with researchers as well. And the other thing, if you use HISE data and if you focus on formal workers, you can deduce by the industry whether those individuals face higher income risks. So if you put two individuals the same, maybe they work for the government, so they have security, job security, we can extract to see if those people with the same default risk, they face different types of loans. And the other type of reasons why this is happening, this is very important because we need to draw policy implications out of this research, is this happening because of financial literacy? If we see high-income people having multiple bank accounts, and they shop around much more than low-income people, that's maybe the reason they always can find the lower rate when compared to low-income people. And maybe they have those fewer frictions. And also, maybe it's because of information, because banks have a long relationship with high-income people. They can collect that information and offer lower rates to them. And this is important because one thing missing is we need to know about the policy implications, not only for the central bank, but also for the government, right? For monetary and fiscal policy. So the central bank, we ask, does the central bank need to account for that when setting monetary policy decisions? So maybe yes, because inequalities affect monetary policy transmission. And as she says, monetary policy transmissions can increase inequality. So the central bank would need to take that into account when making decisions. But more importantly, the fiscal policy, the government, they need to address the root causes of the problem, right? So if this is happening because banks have market power, we would need to increase competition. People need to have multiple bank accounts so they can shop around more easily. Maybe we could increase financial literacy, and people with low income could get better rates. And if it's a story about income risk, because the government is passing through a tough time, so they're changing monetary policy, we could use this information to help the most affected people. And the final comment is a very cheap comment. You don't need to work on that. But Brazil has extremely high interest rates, so it will be interesting to see whether those results apply to other countries, and this could be an interesting area for future research. But to conclude, this is a very strong paper with novel contribution. It opens the path to inequality-aware monetary policy research, and it encourages richer modeling and policy tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mateus. Antonia, would you like to make any comments about the Mateus evaluation?
Yeah, great. So thank you so much for the discussion, Mateus. I really appreciate it, and you've definitely touched on quite a few things that we're also considering. So I'll address the points kind of one by one. So on the identification and, kind of using better measures of income and maybe taking from HIEs to look at substantial subsamples of individuals, that's definitely something that we're interested in and we do plan on doing. So at the minute, we use the income data, the income variable that's reported in the credit registry, just because that has better coverage. As a next step, it would be really good to try and use this HIEs data, which is probably a little bit more reliable because that's verified with the Ministry of Labour. In terms of using subsamples of individuals, I think that's a really good idea, and that's something that we've been thinking about as well, because it would also help inform on some of kind of some other things that you've touched on, like finding out the mechanism. So when we look at subsamples of individuals that are in HIEs, so implicitly that restricts the sample to formal sector workers, so that's something that would help inform on kind of the financial literacy aspect of maybe to what extent this might be caused by financial literacy, if we think that formal and informal work might be correlated with financial literacy. In terms of our data kind of sample length overlapping with COVID. This is also something we're working on. So we're currently working on extending the time period back to 2014. And so that kind of breaks the chronology of the hike and the cut with COVID. We can't go back beyond 2014 because I think before 2014, income data wasn't necessarily reported, and so coverage gets a bit sparse. But definitely, we're trying to bring that back to 2014, and then also within that, trying out different time frames, like cutting out COVID entirely. It would be interesting to see how the results change when we look at 2014 to 2019, for example. And then on credit access, that's, again, something that, ideally we would love to see loan applications, but because we don't, we kind of have to do all of our results conditional on a loan being granted. And so that's why we kind of include these variables, trying to capture the extensive and intensive margin of relationship lending. So we have this variable in our controls, which is whether or not you're new to the financial system, so whether that loan is the first ever record of credit access. And so that kind of, I suppose, tries to control for that aspect, just because we aren't really able to investigate it as well as we would like to. And then finally, on monetary policy surprises, that's also something that we're looking at, because at the minute we're just using levels of the SELIC and levels of interest rates. The reason why we don't use monetary surprises at the minute is because we look at the interest rate on new loans, there would be some kind of aggregation needed in order to find kind of the change in interest rate on new loans within kind of income categories. And so that's definitely something we're looking at, but there's a little bit of a trade-off between kind of granularity and this kind of identification. But we're definitely interested in, and we're definitely also considering kind of implementing these kinds or kind of modifications along these lines. In terms of the mechanism, in terms and kind of why it happens, so that's obviously kind of the natural next step, is trying to figure out, well, maybe banks are just evil in Brazil, or maybe, there is like logic and reason to this, and there's maybe like room for policy, really, rather than just blaming banks. And so in terms of higher default risk, one thing that we've actually been thinking about is creating a forward-looking default measure, because we see the credit registry tracks all loans. So it tracks the cross-section of loans as well as the new loans in each period. So what we can actually do is we can actually find out what the default rate will be for a loan, and we're thinking about using that as a control, kind of, assuming that the bank has perfect foresight. Are interest rates then justified by the default rate that happens? At the minute, we kind of proxy for these kind of risks somewhat poorly, because we just use the volume of kind of the ex-post volume of defaulted rate that an individual has. So at the minute, our default variable is backwards looking, but in future we are thinking about creating kind of a more forward-looking default variable. And financial literacy is kind of another obvious step to kind of look at, and there we're really thinking about incorporating the high-use data to investigate that more. Finally, in terms of policy implications, that's also kind of like something that we want to think about, but we also want to be a little bit more careful about making, these big policy implications before we're kind of very sure on the identification, just because obviously this kind of has very big implications if you're trying to insinuate that monetary policy is increasing inequality, and so there's a role for government policy here. The only thing I would say about this is that, interestingly, I think there would be a little bit of a trade-off between inequality and monetary policy transmission. So one takeaway you might think from this is that if monetary policy is disproportionately affecting lower income individuals, and lower income individuals have the highest MPCs in the economy, then maybe this effect is also amplifying the transmission of monetary policy. So if you take away this kind of heterogeneous pass-through, then you might also dampen the transmission of monetary policy in Brazil. And so that's not necessarily a bad thing, but these are all considerations that kind of need to be taken into account when we're thinking about the policy implications and kind of the role of maybe fiscal or monetary policy in kind of alleviating these inequality considerations. So thank you very much for your comments. They were really helpful.
Thank you, Dania. And any question from the audience? Any questions? Don't be shy.
Me too.
Here, please.
First of all, I want to congratulate you, Antonio. It was very interesting work, and I think you are very careful in your answers to Mateus' comments, which were really great. I have to take some of my questions away, but then one of the things that I suggest that maybe you could try is in terms of the credit access. Although we don't have applications, but we are able to see if the individual has more than one bank, right? So you can see, you can check if this effect is restricted to those that only have one bank, one relationship, compared to the others. I think this is one interesting thing. With the forward-looking, the exposed default rate, I would be a little bit more cautious to it, because if the interest rate is higher, then the interest rate itself may be affecting a higher default rate. So I wouldn't rely on that so much. But I'm looking forward to seeing the next version of the work. Congratulations.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so in terms of credit access and looking at that kind of multi-bank borrowers, that is actually something that the literature does, kind of following Mien and Khwaja strategy, where we look at multi-bank borrowers, and then you can see if it's like kind of certain banks that's driving it. Because we look at new loans at the minute, in a given time period, not too many people take out multiple loans from different banks. And so that's kind of one of the main restrictions on that. We could look at it kind of dynamically. So if you borrow from multiple banks kind of over our whole sample period, so that's something that we're thinking about as well. So, but yeah, that's a really helpful comment. And
yep, excuse me, I'm interrupting you. It is a bit different than the Khwaja-Mien idea, and it's just that the person could get a loan from another bank. Not necessarily it has to, but it has the relationship, not the credit relationship, the account.
Okay,
so
no.
You look just at the account.
So kind of looking back and then saying, have they got multiple relationships
exactly.
with different banks? No, that's actually a really good suggestion. So thank you very much for that comment. On to the next one with the forward-looking exposed default rate. That's also a really good comment, because obviously it might be endogenous. Something that we were actually interested in investigating, potentially won't make it to this paper, is whether these higher interest rates might then be pushing more individuals, more lower income individuals into default. So if you think that monetary policy increases interest rates more for lower income individuals, and so there's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where this then makes low income individuals more risky. That is something that we have thought about. Again, identification there would just be a little bit difficult, and so that's something we're still kind of thinking about and trying to reason our way through, but those are some really interesting and insightful comments. Thank you very much.
We have time for one more question. Please.
Hello, my name is Sergio from Central Bank of Brazil. I was wondering during your presentation if there is no an effect through the yield curve, if we think that the richer can borrow in a longer duration than the poor people. So, and the effect of the change in monetary policy affects the inclination of the yield curve. So maybe you should just consider that instead of Selic, some kind of measure of interest rate of the yield curve that you can obtain from the B3. We have this data swap, and maybe you can just look at the change after the Copom meeting in those interest rates closer to the duration of your loan. So might explain something.
Okay. So just to make sure that I understand your point. So you're saying that maybe, so to address kind of the yield curve kind of within consumers, because we do have maturity of the loan portfolio, and so I suppose through that, you're kind of controlling for longer maturity loans, maybe having a low interest rate. But I think is what you're saying, that maybe it's not just the SELIC. We're looking at kind of the interest rates on the longer term loans, which might be more relevant for richer individuals. Is that kind of the idea? Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And actually there is quite a lot of interesting, there are quite some interesting dynamics going on with maturity that we don't show here, because we actually rerun these regressions with maturity as the dependent variable instead of interest rate, and there's some quite clear heterogeneity that, you know, we're not really sure about what's going on. So that's a really good suggestion that might help us investigate that a little bit more. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions, and John
Thank you. Just one quick question. I'm Gil Duarte from the Central Bank of Brazil, taking the comment from Sergio. From our conversation with banks, they care much more about the 2 or 3 year interest rate than the Selic to when they are, let's say, computing the margin for credit. Just, I think, I fully agree with Sergio that it could be interesting, instead of using Selic, using the 2 or 3 year interest rate.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's super helpful, because that's the kind of insight that you just don't get if without the insider knowledge. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Please, Mateus, feel free to present.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name is Matheus Sampaio, and today I'll present a joint work with Pauline and Sergey on digital payments and monetary policy transmission. And the motivation for this research is that banks' market power can be an impediment to effective monetary policy transmission. Right? Because when the central bank raises rates, it would expect banks to pass on those rates to consumers. So if we have an interest rate hike, we would expect consumers to save more and get less loans. However, banks having market power, they don't need to pass on those rates to consumers, and they can collect the deposit spread, the difference between the rates that they're supposed to get and the rates that they charge. And the reasons they have this market power is because of the service they offer, people like having bank accounts, and the switching costs. So when a new digital payment comes along, it could affect monetary policy in 2 ways, right? The first way, it could actually solidify banks' market power if the biggest banks are the most effective when implementing this new technology, such as having the best mobile apps. Or it could diminish banks' market power by decreasing the switching costs. So if now you can send money from one bank account to another bank account freely and easily, it could decrease the cost from switching from bank A to bank B. So the research question we ask is what is the effect? How do cashless payments change monetary policy transmission? And to answer this question, we explore a very rich administrative data on the central bank on deposits and loan rates after and before the introduction of PIX. We empirically study the spreads, the deposit spreads, the loan spreads in areas of different PIX penetration. Right? First, we look at the cross-sectional comparison between banks. We compare banks that are exposed to areas with higher PIX adoption versus banks that are exposed to areas with low PIX adoption, and we compare them. And within bank, we also compare when a bank has 2 branches and how those branches differently react when a monetary policy shock comes. And then we give foundation, a theoretical foundation to the results that we get. We study the counterfactuals and the channels through which PIX can affect monetary policy transmission, and then I'll be able to present a simple and a structural model, a simple model and a structural model. So this is the outline for the talk. I only have 20 minutes, so I'll trim it down as much as possible. I'll introduce you to the institutional settings, the data, and then the empirical analysis and the results, and then I'll give the intuition for the structural model in the paper. Okay, so the institutional details. As I said before, banks have this market power over deposits because of the service they offer, the convenience, their branches. So when a policy rate increases, banks increase deposit rates by less than the policy rate change, creating these deposit spreads, increasing these deposit spreads. And it's natural that for banks with higher market power, deposit spreads increase more. So to study how a new payment technology affects banks' market power and the transmission of monetary policy, we studied the setting of Brazil with PIX. So as many of you know, PIX is this free instantaneous payment system that is basically account-to-account payment system in which you can transfer money from one account to another by imputing a key or a QR code. And the central bank launched this mechanism in November of 2020. And it did two things. It forced all major banks to adopt, and it made all individual level transactions free. So overall, what we have in Brazil is that 90% of all the banks are inside the system of PIX, and more than 86% of the adult population already use PIX for one type, for receiving or sending transactions. So right now we have survey data indicating that PIX is the most popular type of payment method in Brazil, overcoming cash, credit card, debit card, and cash. So how it would affect bank competition is the following. So PIX could facilitate transfers between payments among banks. So essentially, if you have two bank accounts, you can switch your deposits from one to the other very easily. And the other factor is that with people switching from physical cash to digital money, the use of cash goes down, and the use of bank branches becomes less important. So if you have all your money inside your mobile bank app, you are not necessarily more inclinated to go to a bank and choose a bank because of their branch presence, which was a very strong reason that the big banks had market power in the first place. And so PIX would allow digital banks and banks that don't have a physical presence to enter markets. So PIX would potentially facilitate monetary policy transmission by promoting this competition among banks, which will force them to increase deposit rates when the monetary policy shock comes. Okay, so this is the data from today. This is all public. We have municipal level data on PIX transactions. We have the number of transactions and the value transacted in each municipality. So with the data from the population of each municipality, we can see how much PIX per capita and the use of PIX in each municipality. We also have branch level data from Esteban on deposits and loans for each branch in Brazil. And also we have data from the central bank on interest expenses and interest income, which we use to have a proxy for deposit rates and loan rates, which is used in many other papers. And then we have macro and municipal level data from IBGE and APA and the central bank that we use to train our model and to use as a control. Okay, so let me give you the empirical exercise, right? So we study these spreads, the deposit spreads, in areas of different PIX penetration to get closer to the causality of PIX, right? So we investigate the cross-sectional comparison. We compare banks that are exposed to different levels of PIX, essentially. And then within banks, we compare branches that are exposed to different levels of PIX. So in the cross-sectional comparison, we regress the deposit spreads into the monetary policy change to get beta. And essentially, beta is the elasticity of deposit spreads to monetary policy changes. And then we compare what happens, what was that beta before the introduction of PIX, and we compare to what happens to after the introduction of PIX. Does those deposit spreads goes down? And this is what we have when we plot the banks in Brazil. So the banks that have higher exposed to PIX, they are located in areas with higher PIX per capita. They change their behavior more. They lower the deposit spreads. So those banks that are in those areas, they are forced to decrease their deposit spreads and decrease their profits. So, but you can say, okay, banks that choose different areas, they're extremely different from one another. They have different strategies. This might be endogenous. And yes, that's true. So what we do now is we look within the same bank. We compare two branches in municipality A and B. We have municipality fixed effects. We have bank time fixed effects. So essentially, we're comparing two municipalities. They're very similar. And once some monetary policy shock comes, municipality A has more PIX per capita, and what we find is that they will respond differently from municipality B. So we get closer to the causality that we want, right? So when we regress the deposit spreads into this monetary policy shock interacted with PIX per capita, what we get is a negative estimate, saying that the deposit spreads in those municipalities that have higher exposure to PIX, they decrease the deposit spread. So banks are forced to increase rates more in municipalities that have higher PIX. So, and then we create a model and a structural model, a simple model and a structural model to try to explain those results and give a theoretical foundation to them. We have this simple model, which is basically a circular city with n banks, and people are, banks are distributed across this city. So essentially, what people, the decision of each person in that simple model, in that city, is to choose their own banks. They choose their own banks based on the rates that they give, the services that they give, and the distance to them. Distance matters because you don't want to go far away for a bank branch. And what we find in this model is that if you live very closely to bank I, you probably choose bank I. If you live very closely to bank J, you probably choose bank J. But if you're in the middle and you want to maximize your utility from the services, if the services are complementary, you choose both banks. And what happens in this comparative statics from this simple model is that if we reduce the transportation cost, what we'll have is people choosing multiple banks, choosing to have multiple banks. And that's the idea for PIX. If you don't need to go to the branch multiple times, you are not so sensitive to the distance to the branch. So you're more willing to have multiple bank accounts. And also, if you have new banks entering the market, because distance is not a factor anymore, we'll have people also choosing to have multiple bank accounts at the same time, right? And here's the structural model. I'll give some intuition as well. And with this model, we can get, we can understand the channels for which PIX is having an effect on monetary policy, and we can also able to see what will happen to Brazil if PIX disappears tomorrow. So the model intuition is simple. So we have 4 players. We have households, firms, banks, and the government. Households, they have savings, and they choose where to put their money between banks, bank A, B, C, between just carrying cash and not having any interest rates, or putting in short-term bonds. So they decide this by maximizing their utility. They have sensitivities to characteristics such as distance and the deposit rate. For firms, they choose where to borrow, so they can choose not to borrow at all, the banks, ABC, and the bonds. And they also have sensitivity to the rates of the loan. And then we model banks as this imperfect competition. We follow this paper by Wang, Whitted, Wu, and Chow, where we have financial friction such as market power, capital, and reserve requirements. And then governments, they set the policy rate, the monetary policy rate. And what will happen is that PICs will come and will change the sensitivity to deposit rates. So people, once they have PICs, they will be more sensitive to the deposit. They want the best return, more than they want a bank that is closer to them. So we estimate this model, we calibrate the parameters using data from the central bank. We estimate deposits and loans via BLP, and the bank parameters by SMD. And here's the contrafactual, okay? So here we can see the impact of PICs on the deposit rate, right? As the Selic rate raises, banks are forced to raise rates to consumers. And we can capture this effect in the graph. So, and the same thing goes for loans. We're able to see that once the central bank raises rates with PICs, we have fewer people getting loans. So that's exactly the result that we want to see. We want to see a central bank, once they set a monetary policy shock, we want to see savings go up and loan amounts go down. And PICs is one of the culprits, one of the reasons that we see this. So let me conclude. So digital payments, what we found is in this paper is that digital payments like PICs can reduce the switching costs and increase competition in the deposit market. Banks with higher exposure to PICs, we see them having larger increases in deposit rates following monetary policy increase, and the smaller deposit outflows. So savings go up after interest rates hikes. And the structural model confirms that digital payments strengthen monetary policy transmission. And if I can leave you with one thing out of this presentation, is that payment technologies not only have been shown to help individuals and firms and banks, but what we're showing in this paper is that they can also improve the effectiveness of central bank tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matheus. To discuss, I call Jorge Abad, please.
Okay, so I would like to start by saying thanks to the organizers for the opportunity to discuss this great paper. So the motivation for the paper, as it was just explained, is pretty straightforward. We want to know what is the effect of digital payments on the transmission of monetary policy. Now, the reason why digital payments might have an effect on monetary policy transmission is because banks do have market power when setting interest rates for their clients. And this market power might limit the effect or might limit the pass-through of monetary policy rate changes. When interest rates increase, banks with market power might decide not to increase the interest rate as much as the monetary authority. Now, digital payments can affect the market power of banks in several dimensions. As it was explained, market power can go up or down after the interaction of a digital payment system. Particularly, the authors are going to find that digital payments indeed lower market power of banks by reducing switching costs. And what they want to do is to analyze what is the effect of this on transmission of monetary policy. So what they are going to do is that they use the introduction of an instant payment system in Brazil named PIX, most of you might be familiar with, and use it as a natural experiment to see, to disentangle the causal effect of the availability of these digital payments on bank market power, and through this on the transmission of monetary policy. So they are going to do several things. They are going to exploit the geographical variation in PIX adoption to see the cross-sectional estimates of the effect of the adoption of this system on market power of banks and the transmission of monetary policy. Then they are also going to look at within-bank regressions using PIX effects. And to better understand what are the mechanisms behind the effects that they find, they are also going to develop a simple theoretical model to get the intuitions. And then also they are going to estimate a dynamic structural banking model with which they can run counterfactuals and also quantify what is the impact of the interaction of PIX. I'm going to summarize the main results in the paper. They find that after the interaction of PIX, in geographical areas with more adoption, then banks are going to see, they're going to show stronger responses to changes in policy rate, which suggests that interaction of PIX decreases market power of banks. They're also going to observe higher deposit outflows and larger loan contractions. And the counterfactual they run are going to suggest that this effect indeed comes from the reduction in market power. So they run the dynamic model with and without market power of banks, and they see that this is one of the main drivers of the results that they find. Now, as of my general comments, I'm going to say this is a very polished and complete paper, so there's not much that I can say on additional things that they can do, or not going to enter in detail on a discussion of the results that they provide, but rather I'm going to focus on a more big picture type of discussion on how to, what strategy to follow and how to better sell what they already have, which is a lot. So as I said, very nice execution, many robustness exercises. There's not many things that one could do better than what they already do, but I'm going to try to provide a few suggestions. So these are going to be mainly on the motivation of the different exercises and the connection between them. I'm going to suggest a few more things that they can use their structural dynamic model for, and then some suggestions for extensions or maybe future work. So comment number one is on the motivation for the different exercises and the connection between them. So my reading of the paper is that there's I missed some connection, or there's some disconnect between the different exercises, particularly the empirical and the theoretical part. I missed some discussion of what each of these contributes. In particular, because the cross-sectional results in the first part, in the empirical part, might not generalize. One cannot easily extrapolate that what they find in the cross-section can indeed be generalized to the aggregate outcomes. So this is only different. They can find the differential response in the cross-section, but this doesn't tell me what is going to happen at the aggregate level with the interaction of PIX. Theoretical models that they use, the simple one and also the dynamic model, help bridging this gap. But I think being more explicit about the limitation of the cross-sectional results, and how the theoretical model can address these limitations would be useful for the reader to understand why you might need so many different parts to the paper. In particular, some of the cross-sectional results are, and when discussing these cross-sectional results, some claims about the aggregate are made that I think one cannot really make until you use the theoretical model and the dynamic structural model. Now, once you make the effort to build a structural dynamic model and to estimate it, I think there's many things that you can do with it, and I find it, I missed some things that to me were kind of obvious that you could do, but that made me think that this part of the paper might be underdeveloped. Like structural dynamic model seems not very utilized. So in particular, the author saw these policy functions that I'm showing here. They allow you to tell what are going to be the response of a particular set of variables when everything is kept constant, but you only change the interest rate. Now, the thing is that with the dynamic structural model, when you change the policy rate, also the state variables of banks are going to be changing. So there's many things that move, not only the interest rate, for which you might want to run the dynamic responses to a shock. This is something you can easily do, like sort of the impulse response function to an interest rate shock. And the response of your model, we cannot completely gauge from the policy function that you show. In particular, one more thing that you can learn from these dynamic responses is whether your model is able to quantitatively capture what you observe in your empirical results. Now, this is one of the things, one of the useful things that you can do with this type of models. But I think you run a bit short on that, on comparing the quantitative predictions. You stay only at the qualitative part. But I think you can use the model to compare whether the numbers you get really make sense when compared to the data. Now, I would suggest that you could also run additional counterfactuals that can provide further insights. In particular, you only look at the role, a counterfactual economy in which there's no market power of banks. But you could also run other counterfactuals related to the role of regulations, for instance, capital requirements, because these shocks are going to have an effect on the net worth of banks. And through this, you might have that banks that are more constrained versus banks that are less constrained might have different responses. And this might be also useful for your analysis. Now, comment number 3 is kind of a cheap comment. I mean, this is more like things I would like to see in the paper. But of course, you can also. There's as many things you can ask for the paper. So maybe it's for an extension, maybe for future work. I think it would be the cherry on top for a fantastic paper already. So, but I think there's limited discussion of real economic impacts. So you stop at the very first step of the transmission channel of monetary policy, which is transmission to bank interest rates. But then you can also, I mean, there might be other general equilibrium effects that affect also non-bank borrowers. That might be interesting to analyze, and that could really tell you whether transmission of monetary policy is enhanced or not with the interaction of peaks, because so far you only look at the transmission to banks. But to the broader economy, it remains to be seen whether changes in monetary policy transmit more to, say, output, inflation, and real variables in general. So this is just this final suggestion. Now to conclude, as I said, I think this is a very timely and well-executed paper of interest to many of the people in the audience, policymakers. They find digital payments reduce bank market power, so this should enhance monetary policy transmission. But then I think exploring the real economic effects would broaden the impact of the paper and see whether, and allow us to see whether indeed monetary policy is enhanced or not with interaction of peaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. Matheus, would you like to make comments?
I just want to thank you. Very good comments. I took notes, and I'll probably ask for your slides, and very cool ideas. Not much more than that.
Okay, and Any question from the audience? Please.
Hi, Mateus. Thank you a lot for the presentation. It was very good. So in the model, I guess you can identify what's coming when you change like the peaks, the elasticity of demand, but also the conduct of the banks, right?
Yeah.
So if you do like the counterfactor by changing one or the other, can you kind of see what's really kind of changing the data? Is closer to what's changing the data or not?
Yeah, so the channel we see the results is mostly the deposit channel. So it's mainly people changing banks and being more sensitive to those rates. I think that.
Okay. Any more questions? Please.
Hi, Matthias. Congratulations, very nice paper. I was wondering about the timing of the introduction of PIC. So if I recall this correctly, this was in 2019, so short before COVID. And so we have here some colleagues, I understand, from, for example, Nubank, which is a digital bank, and we know that in Brazil, digital banks and all digital platforms and fintechs have been booming since then, particularly, right, driven, among other reasons, by the pandemic, which is part of the sample. And I was wondering if that plays a role. So can we, in the extreme case, replicate your model and replace PICs by something else and get the same results? So is this really specific about PICs? Or is it about a more general phenomenon that we can attribute to a digitalization of finance that operates beyond a payment system in particular, even considering the specificities of PICs? Thank you.
Yes, for sure. So Nubank has been around for a while. PIX was introduced in 2020. So we already had this massive growth in digital banks before PIX. And for sure, I agree that PIX played a big role in even developing more banks. And that's why the empirical part of the paper, I don't claim to be causal, because it's very hard to, we don't have an instrument, it's very hard to disentangle those things. And that's why we use the model to see if it, controlling for all those, by modeling this, we can see the same results. Is it actually people caring about much more about deposit rates than anything else? And oh yeah, for sure, it's very hard to disentangle the growth of digital banks and the push to the growth in banks in general during COVID. Most of the population in Brazil got access to Caixa Tem during the pandemic, so we saw a huge the increase in the number of banked people. So right now we almost 200 million people banked in Brazil out of 210 million. So that's quite remarkable.
Okay, please.
Nice paper, Mateus. So one question here. Do you have information on the composition of those deposits into time deposits and non-time deposits? Have you examined how that composition changes in regard to the heterogeneity of PICS penetration?
So when we analyze deposit rates, that's a very good comment, is that we proxy that using interest expenses. So it's mostly time deposits. Yeah, we cannot see deposit, especially because all the big banks just follow poupança, so we wouldn't be able to see the deposit spread.
But you'll be able to see volumes of both,
yes.
Right?
Yes, for sure. Yeah, that's something we can do. Okay.
Any more questions? Please.
Yes, regarding your empirical part of the paper, you are using data from SBAN. So basically what we are doing is an analysis about traditional banks and regional banks, state-owned regional banks. So I think first you should, in your interpretation, make clear that this is the results for traditional banks, not for digital banks, because For digital bank, very clearly that the results would be different. They have basically 100% of the policy rate paying on deposits, so it's different. And then in your model, I think you could add explicitly a digital bank with a travel cost equal to 0, and then do some statistics to see what happens when, let's say, a digital bank enter a market after peak, something like that, so that you can, in some way, add digital banks to your empirical, to your paper in general, because I think it's missing this competition between traditional and digital banks in the paper.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's the main weakness of Esteban, is the lack of data from digital banks. And yeah, there's basically nothing we can do about it, but I love your idea of including and making some exercises with the model with a supposed entrance of a digital bank. It is very good. Thank you.
Any more questions? No? Let's move on to the next paper. George, the floor is yours.
Okay, so let me thank again the organizers for including our paper in the program, and also the Central Bank of Brazil for their hospitality. So the title of the paper is the Heterogeneous Bank Lending Channel of Monetary Policy. This is joint work with Saki Villo, who is a professor at UCLA, and colleagues from the Bank of Spain, Salomón García Villegas, Joel Marbet, and Galo Nuño. The usual disclaimer applies. So there's a long literature that has analyzed the effect of bank heterogeneity on monetary policy transmission. So without being comprehensive, we cite here some studies that look at different bank-level characteristics to analyze what are the effect of these characteristics on the transmission of monetary policy. There's been work on the proportion of liquid assets of these banks and how this affects monetary policy transmission, also the size of banks, their leverage, exposure to interest rate risk, or loan rate fixation. So banks lending in fixed rate loans versus banks lending in adjustable or variable rate loans. Now, what these cross-sectional studies do not tell you is what is the effect of this heterogeneity on aggregate responses. This is related to the point I tried to make during my discussion. In particular, what this gives you is for a given distribution of bank-level characteristics, what is the differential impact of monetary policy on each of these banks. However, we as researchers and policymakers might also be interested in what would be the effect of a change in this distribution of bank-level characteristics on aggregate responses to, in this case, monetary policy shocks. So in order to be able to address this question, what we're going to do is, well, first, we document heterogeneity in euro area banks, capital ratios, and loan rate fixation practices. And then with these facts in mind, we are going to build a heterogeneous banks quantitative macro model in which there are two bank-level characteristics that are going to play an important role. First, we're going to have exposed or endogenous heterogeneity in bank capital ratios, and ex-ante or exogenous heterogeneity in loan rate fixation. So you can think of countries in which banks typically lend in fixed rate loans versus countries in which banks typically lend in adjustable or variable rate loans. What we are going to find, well, what we're going to do is that we are going to use this model to provide some long-run distributional features to match some of the long-run distributional features of the banking sector in the euro area, in particular, the cross-sectional distribution of bank size, capital ratios, and marginal propensities to lend. I'm going to be more specific about what I mean with these marginal propensities to lend. Then we are also going to study dynamic responses to monetary policy shocks. both at the aggregate level and at the bank individual level. We are going to observe with the model that there's a stronger contraction in credit for banks that operate in fixed rate loans countries and banks that operate with lower capital ratios. So these two variables that I highlighted in the previous slide are going to be the main determinants of how strong is the response in credit to a contractionary monetary policy shock. We're also going to draw some implications for financial stability. Now, regarding the stylized facts of bank heterogeneity in the euro area, what you observe is that there's a substantial degree of heterogeneity in terms of the capital ratio distribution of across European banks. So you see this distribution is so to the left it only goes so low as to the regulatory requirements, but then the right tail has some dispersion that ideally we want to capture with the model. You cannot see here, but there's also heterogeneity in the distance to the capital requirement. I mean, some of this heterogeneity can be a reflection of differences in regulatory requirements for banks, but we also observe that there's heterogeneity in the distance to capital requirements that we want our model to be able to capture. Now, there's also heterogeneity in loan rate fixation. So here you observe, you can see the share of variable rate loans or adjustable rate loans for households in the left panel and for non-financial corporations in the right panel. What we see, and this is for some particular time periods, but we observe that these are very persistent measures, that there are some countries with a particularly high share of fixed rate loans. This in the European Union would be, in the euro area would be Germany, France, Belgium, and Netherlands. And then we have a set of countries in which most loans are variable rate loans, particularly Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Finland. So this is the other important characteristic that we want our model to be able to reflect. So now I'm going to describe the main model ingredients. So in the spirit of time, I'm not going to go in every detail about the model, but I want to give you a flavor of what are the ingredients of this model. So we are going to assume that there's a banking sector that consists of perfectly competitive banks that are atomistic in size. And these banks are going to hold central bank reserves and issue risky long-term loans. On the liability side, these banks are funded by perfectly insured deposits. These deposits are insured by the government, and they are funded with their own equity capital. We assume there are frictions to issuance of external equity. In particular, we assume it's infinitely costly, so there's only, like in line with other macro models with banks, that banks only accumulate equity via their retained earnings. So equity is going to be slow moving in a model, and shocks to the profitability of banks are going to have persistent effects. Now, banks in this model choose the new loan origination, so they start with some portfolio of existing long-term loans. They choose every period the new loan origination, their funding structure, so the amount of deposits they borrow, and then reserve holdings and dividend payments, subject to a set of constraints that are given by regulation. Particularly, we have a minimum capital requirement, which, if violated, implies the failure of these banks. These banks are closed by the regulator if they fail to comply with the minimum capital requirement. The other softer requirement that is less stringent, which is the buffer requirement, which, if violated, limits the ability of banks to pay dividends and to issue new loans, but does not imply immediate resolution of the bank. And then there's a liquidity requirement, which requires a certain fraction of reserve holdings proportional to the deposits that these banks issue. As I said, we are going to consider two different institutional setups. We are going to consider one economy in which all banks lend fixed rate loans, and another economy in which all banks originate only variable or adjustable rate loans. And this is going to create ex ante or exogenous heterogeneity across these different countries. Finally, we assume that there's the amount of loans that default in a given portfolio of a given bank is going to be stochastic, and this generates some exposed heterogeneity in capital ratios. So banks that suffered high loan default rates for a number of periods are going to have a lower capital ratio. Banks that with very good results and very good profitability have more positive capital ratios in principle. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on the assets of these banks. So banks, the loans are long-term and they are risky, as I said. So the amount of loans that fail each period in the portfolio of a bank is stochastic. This can be fixed rate or variable rate loans. And importantly, issuing new loans is going to incur a origination cost that is increasing and convex. Reserves, on the other hand, are safe and they are short-term, so they mature in one period. And they just earn the policy rate that is decided by the monetary authority. Now, to close the model, the non-financial sector, it's comprised of a set of entrepreneurs that demand loans for investment, and they are sensitive to loan rates. So we are going to have a demand curve for bank credit. Households are going to supply deposits, and they own the banks, so they receive the dividends that the banks pay. And then there's a central bank that, as I said, sets the policy rate, and a government that runs a deposit insurance agency. So whenever banks fail, the government via taxes covers the interest and principal of these deposits. So just to recap, I want to highlight what are the main frictions in the model. Because of the existence of deposit insurance and limited liability on the side of banks, there's going to be incentives of banks to maximize their leverage. This is because if returns are high, these banks are going to enjoy these high returns, but if the returns are low and banks fail, their losses are going to be limited to their initial equity contributions. So this is a typical risk-shifting type of friction that's going to make banks only enjoy the upside and not the downside, incentivizing leverage. Now, as I said, there's also loan adjustment costs and slow-moving equity, coming from the fact that banks only accumulate equity via retained earnings, which is make that leverage of banks is going to be slow-moving. Following shocks, the leverage of these banks is going to be adjusting slowly. This is because of the loan adjustment costs. A bank that might want to increase its leverage very quickly might be forced not to do so because the cost that is increasing and convex of issuing new loans is going to prohibit the bank from doing so. So leverage adjusts slowly. Now, because of the existence of credit risk and capital regulation that might force the bank to close down if it violates the capital requirement, and the existence of a slow-moving leverage is going to make that banks endogenously decide on capital buffers above the regulatory minimum, and this is also going to play a role because, as I said, leverage is going to have an effect on bank choices. I'm going to show you in a second. So here it says main transmission channel. It should rather say the main amplification channel is monetary policy shocks are going to affect profitability of banks, and they are going to affect profitability of banks differentially depending on whether these banks are high leverage or low leverage, and depending on whether these banks have fixed rate loans or variable rate loans. Now, the effect on capital accumulation, because of the regulatory constraints, is going to have an impact on lending. So there's going to be some banks that are very close to the constraint, and those banks cannot adjust their lending easily. Those are going to be more affected. There are going to be banks for which their constraint is more slack, and then those banks are not going to suffer as much as a consequence of monetary policy shocks. So that's the main amplification channel that I want to highlight. So the calibration of the model matches a number of characteristics of the balance sheets of European banks in our sample. So capital ratios, liquid assets, loan maturities, and riskiness of loans, and so on. We're also going to calibrate the requirements in general in the model, capital requirements, buffer requirements, liquidity requirements to replicate Basel III. And then we are going to calibrate some of the parameters of the model to target the average response of lending and loan rates to monetary policy shocks. Now, for today, I'm only going to focus on a scenario in which there's a full pass-through of monetary policy shocks to the liabilities of banks. Now we know, and we saw in the previous presentation, that pass-through to bank liabilities is not always perfect, in particular for deposits. So for the next iteration of the model, we want to analyze what would be the effects of having imperfect pass-through as opposed to what we have so far, which is full pass-through of monetary policy shocks to bank liabilities. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of our main results. I'm not going to have time to discuss everything that we have, and this is still work in progress, so there's much more that we want to do eventually, but this is what we find more interesting so far. So in terms of the long run, so the steady state of the model, we have a distribution of bank leverage. So not all banks have the same leverage in the model because of the frictions that I highlighted before. And this gives rise to a distribution of marginal propensities to lend. So what we mean by marginal propensities to lend, similar to the literature of heterogeneous households and under analysis of marginal propensities to consume, the marginal propensities to lend is the increase in lending that a bank would be willing to do if given one extra unit of equity. So there's going to be some banks here to the right of the distribution that are the ones with more leverage, so they are the ones closer to regulatory constraints. These are banks that are very constrained that if given one unit of equity, they would increase their lending by a lot. In particular, here we find a number of 2. So this means that not only this extra unit of equity, but these banks would lever up more. They would borrow deposits, and they would then increase their lending twice as much as their increase in equity. Now, there are some other banks that are not as constrained. So the banks to the left here, in the lower percentiles of the leverage distribution, that would not increase their lending as much. So this already gives you an idea of how differentially leveraged banks are going to respond differentially to changes in their equity. Okay, but now it remains to be seen how they are going to respond to changes in monetary policy shocks. But as I anticipated, the amplification mechanisms works through the effect they have on their equity. Now for the dynamic responses, here we have the aggregate ones. So aggregate responses to a monetary policy shock, differentiating between the economy with fixed rate loans, which is the solid blue line, and with variable rate loans, which is the dashed dotted red line. So first, if you focus on the top right panel here, you can see that there's a 1 percentage point increase in the policy rate that is persistent and lasts for a number of periods. This translates into a 1 percentage point increase in the cost of the interest rate of the liabilities of the bank. Now, the effect on the loan rates is very different for fixed rate loan banks and variable rate loan banks. The reason for this is that the interest rate at origination for a fixed rate loan is going to be the interest rate that this loan pays over the whole lifetime of the loan, whereas for variable rate loan banks, they are going to adjust, they are going to change over time with the policy rate. So that's why the increase in the variable rate loans is much higher than for fixed rate loan banks. Now, this is the loan rate of new loans, but then what is relevant for the profits of the bank is the interest rate, the average effective loan rate on the whole portfolio of loans. So here you see that the transmission for fixed rate banks is much, much smaller because of all the loans that were originated in the past with a fixed rate that do not see a change in the rate that they are paying. Whereas for the variable rate loan bank, the increase is going to be the same as for new loans because all loans in its portfolio are going to pay the same interest rate. Now, if you focus now on the bottom left panel, which is the panel on equity, you see that the contractionary monetary policy shock is contractionary for bank equity. This is because of the effect on the net interest margin that these banks earn. So the increase in the interest rate of liabilities is higher than the increase in the interest rate of assets. Then profitability of these banks suffer, and there's a decrease in the equity over time because a decrease in the retained earnings. Now, what's interesting here is that the decrease for fixed rate loans is much higher, and this is a result of the fact that the interest rate on loans does not go up as much for these banks, as I highlighted before. Now, capital ratio of fixed rate banks also decreased by more. And this is why, or one of the reasons why the decrease in new loans, or contraction in credit, is stronger for banks in fixed rate economies in this setup. So this is telling you about what is the effect of fixed rate versus loan rate. And what remains to be discussed is the effect of high leverage versus low leverage banks. But just a note, I said we were also able to say something about the effect on financial stability. You see, because of the effect on the capital ratio is more negative for fixed rate banks, then they also increase their probability of failure by more. And then one of the extensions that we are currently working on is to see whether more gradual increases in monetary policy rates might have, what is the effect of that, or of the degree of graduality on the probability of failure of these banks, so giving banks more time to adjust. Now, the last result is about the cross-sectional heterogeneity, as I said. So banks with more leverage, so banks at the right side of the distribution of leverage, are going to have stronger decreases in the amount of in the new loans that they provide after the monetary policy shock. And also the fixed rate banks are going to be the ones that suffer the most. So the fact that this is increasing, or in this case decreasing with leverage, is coming from this graph that I showed you before on the marginal propensities to lend. The fact that fixed rate banks decrease their leverage more is coming from the fact that I highlighted before, that loan rates or net interest margin decreases by more for fixed rate loan banks than for variable rate loan banks. So this would be the last of our results. Running out of time, so let me just conclude by saying that in the paper we document the stylized facts about the heterogeneity in euro area banks, both in terms of leverage and loan rate fixation patterns in different countries. We develop a model of heterogeneous banks that is able to reproduce some of these patterns. And we use the model to study the aggregate and individual responses to monetary policy shocks, finding that the contraction in credit is stronger for banks with higher leverage or lower capital ratios, and in countries in which banks lend in fixed rate loans. And with that, I conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jorge. To discuss the paper, I call Antônia. Só o pessoal do áudio, aqui uma das televisões desligou.
Great, so thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. I thought it was a really interesting paper with a lot of potential and super relevant to the literature and also my own work. So just a really quick recap on what the paper does. It builds a quantitative model featuring banks that differ in leverage, and this difference in leverage is kind of generated endogenously in the model. They then examine this in two environments, one where banks only issue fixed rate loans and one where banks only issue variable rate loans. And what they find is that there's higher pass-through of monetary policy for the environment issuing fixed rate loans, and then kind of within an environment for higher leverage banks. So I think the contribution here is really nice in, kind of echoing just what Jorge said. There's kind of a very large empirical literature on the bank lending channel and what characteristics determine pass-through across banks. But, to my knowledge, that empirical literature isn't quite matched on the theory side of things. So it's really nice that we have this quantitative model where leverage heterogeneity is endogenous to the model, and then we can use it for calibration and counterfactual and aggregate analysis. And so I'll just cover the mechanism of the models very briefly. So in this model, kind of two things matter for leverage. So firstly, you get these exogenous default shocks to banks' loan portfolios. And that's realized after the loan choice is made. So this is then compounded by this loan origination cost, which is convex in the leverage of new loans. So when monetary policy tightens, what happens is that, by assumption, there's 100% pass-through to the interest rate on deposits. This erodes the net interest margin because pass-through to loan rates is less than 1, and so profit and equity fall. And this increases leverage, which is then worsened by this convex loan origination cost. The capital buffer constraint then binds more for higher leverage banks, and so higher leverage banks need to contract lending by more in order to deleverage. So that's how the transmission mechanism of leverage works. On the fixed versus variable interest rate regime, we note that the net interest income depends on the average effective interest rate of a bank's loan portfolio. So if a bank issues variable rate loans, then this is just equal to the interest rate on new loans, this RTL. However, if banks only issue fixed rate loans, then this effective average interest rate is the weighted average of the interest rate yesterday and the new interest rate today. And so the reason why fixed and variable interest rate regimes matter for monetary policy transmission is that, again, when the monetary policy rate contracts, the deposit rate goes up mechanically because we assume 100% pass-through. And again, loan rates rise, but not as much as the deposit rate. Now, because fixed rate loans are a weighted average of the lower interest rate yesterday and the post-hike higher interest rate on new loans today, almost mechanically that average effective interest rate is lower. And so under the fixed rate system, the effects of a monetary policy hike on banks' loan rate is dampened, and so this means the effect on profit and equity is amplified. So their net interest margins are eroded by more, and so the capital requirement binds by more and forces lending to contract. So this kind of leads me on to my first suggestion, which is to increase the discussion of how the equilibrium loan rate is determined in this model. So personally, I don't think that the assumption of 100% pass-through to deposit is a problem, because empirically it is established that deposit rate pass-through is higher than loan rate pass-through, and so this to me seems like a good simplifying assumption to really isolate the effects going through loan rates. But what I would like to see more is probably a little bit more discussion of this loan rate, because it is very central to all the mechanisms that pass through to the loan rate is less than 1. And so I think, again, this is not a criticism of the model whatsoever, but just because of kind of the complexity needed to generate this endogenous heterogeneity and leverage, sometimes the transmission mechanisms or how these equilibrium objects are determined can be a little bit more clouded than if the model was a bit simpler. So here I'd like to see kind of discussion on kind of why the interest rate pass-through is less than 1. You know, I think that the model operates under perfect competition, and so there to me, it seems like there must be some other friction that's going on that I may be not picking up on, that I would like to see maybe discussed a little bit more. Kind of along the same lines, it would also be interesting to discuss why pass-through is different across the regimes with fixed or variable interest rate. Again, just kind of intuitively, I would have thought that, you know, conditional on having the same stock of existing liabilities, that the interest rate on new loans in the fixed rate regime would simply jump higher, such that the average effective interest rates were the same across these two regimes. And so maybe a little bit of discussion of why those two differ would be quite interesting for understanding the transmission mechanisms that are important to fixed versus variable rate interest rate regimes. Again, kind of final point on this, it seems like here higher pass-through in terms of a larger contraction in credit volumes is because there's lower pass-through to interest rates. So this to me seems a little bit counterintuitive, because you're saying that the price of loans is rising by less, and then that's causing the volume of loans to fall by more. Whereas I suppose maybe from the empirical literature, you would expect a larger contraction in loan volumes to instead push up the price of loans by more. So again, this isn't a criticism of the model at all, but I just think it might be interesting to include this kind of discussion to kind of really understand the mechanisms behind the model in this kind of slightly more complex environment. So kind of aside from that, I do have a couple of comments of some things that I think the model would be really useful to look at. And so the first thing that I would like to see, or that I suggest for the authors, is to separate the two channels. So it'd be really interesting to see the effects of kind of the two key model features being heterogeneity and leverage and the fixed versus variable loan rates separately. So kind of abstracting from the fixed versus variable loan rate regime, is it the case that heterogeneity in banks' leverage ratios has aggregate effects, or does it only affect the cross-section of lending across banks? And kind of building onto this, how important is average leverage in determining the aggregate response to monetary policy? So how does the aggregate response to monetary policy, and how sensitive is it to kind of the average bank leverage ratio in an economy? And then the other way, so kind of abstracting from any heterogeneity in leverage, kind of what's the baseline effect of having fixed versus variable loan rates? Kind of once those two channels have been separated, I think it'd also be very interesting to investigate kind of the interaction of these two channels. So again, just pulling up that final graph, it kind of seems here that to an extent being variable rate or fixed rate is interchangeable with your leverage. So here you could kind of ask the question, to what degree are these substitutes? So if a country has variable rate loans and highly leveraged banks, would we expect transmission to differ substantially from a country with fixed rate loans but much less leveraged banks? And this also lends to kind of some very interesting analysis that you can do that might have some real implications for policy. So at the minute, the model is kind of calibrated to the euro area as a whole, and then what's changed is this assumption of whether loan rates are fixed or variable. And so implicitly, you kind of assume that all countries have the same heterogeneity in bank leverage. But given that your model has two dimensions of heterogeneity, you could instead investigate 4 scenarios. You could investigate high and low leverage across fixed and variable rate regimes. And so, I just did this very quickly, so it might not be the most precise, but on the left, that's kind of the graph that we were showing that there's a little bit of a dichotomy in the shares of variable rate loans. And on the right, I just pulled up kind of the average bank leverage ratios in the Eurozone, and these are ordered in the same way. The point here really is that it doesn't really seem like there's a correlation between your share of variable rate loans and your average bank leverage ratio. And so all 4 of these categories are represented in the euro area. And so I think that this makes for quite an interesting setup where you could use this model to answer a very interesting question on the extent to which differences in monetary policy transmission across the euro area might be being mitigated or caused by differences in these 2 dimensions of heterogeneity. And I think there is a lot of appetite to kind of understand why the transmission of monetary policy might differ across the Eurozone. So instead of calibrating the model to the Eurozone as a whole, you could calibrate the model to each country individually and then use that to perform counterfactuals. And there's a lot of policy implications that would kind of arise from this, but kind of one that I would like to highlight is maybe you could investigate whether the model recommends that capital requirements should differ depending on the unique features of a country's banking system if we want to kind of harmonize the transmission of monetary policy across the euro area. So that's all I've prepared for today. Again, just to conclude, I thought this was a really fantastic paper, really interesting with a lot of potential, and I'm really excited to see the next version. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonia. Feel free to respond.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very kind words and great suggestions. I would summarize most of your comments as suggestions of things that we can do, and I think these are all great. We've taken the time to build a model and produce some baseline results, and now what remains to be done is mostly tailoring different types of counterfactual economies with which we can assess the effects of the different channels, and the directions that you've given us are indeed very useful. So a lot of food for thought. I'm going to also ask you to send the slides, and these are all great suggestions. Yeah, regarding your point about why the transmission of loan rates of monetary policy structures to loan rates is imperfect, I fully agree. We need to do more to show where are these effects coming from. But what we've done preliminary so far indicates that these are coming from the supply of banks, and in particular coming from the convex or origination costs. Now, because banks reduce their new lending as a response to the shock, the increasing and convex costs are reduced more than proportionally, and then banks do not pass through the increasing rates as much. And then, well, there were some comments on why the fixed rate jumped by less. We need to explain this more carefully, but this is basically because the increase is carried through the whole lifetime of the loan, whereas it's only temporary for variable rate loans. That's why borrowers are willing to accept only a lower increase in their rates because they are going to be paying that higher rate throughout the whole lifetime of the loan. But then your second point, I would summarize as asking whether heterogeneity matter, and this is one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this model, and this is something we are currently working on trying to respond. Our preliminary findings indicate that it indeed matters, and if you were to have a representative bank, the effects would not be the same, but we need to sit down and carefully think of the exact exercise that we are going to use to show this. I think this would be the most important exercise, so the comment was spot on. And finally, on policy recommendations, we tried so far to avoid doing those in the acknowledgement of that our model doesn't reflect all the reasons why you might want to have capital regulation and why you might want to change it or not. But yeah, we might want to think how to incorporate those in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Please.
Hi, Jorge. Thank you for the paper. Super interesting. And also, Antonia, congratulations for the great discussion. So I kept thinking about the fact that obviously in the model you're assuming that you have this squeeze in net interest margins because deposit rates adjust, right? And at the same time, we know that there are so many papers around showing the frictions involved in that process, even alternative monetary policy transmissions, right, that have been highlighted recently, that precisely leverage on the fact that there is some stickiness in the pass-through of monetary policy rates on deposit rates. So how is this being handled in the model? Do you assume a 1-1 pass-through basically to deposit rates? And if so, what are the implications of playing a little bit or allowing for some leeway in that assumption in the model? At least conceptually, I will be curious to hear your opinion about it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we basically assume that the interest rate on deposits is always equal to the policy rate, so the pass-through is perfect. Now we know this is highly counterfactual, and indeed, as you pointed out, deposit rates are sticky. So this is the extension on which we are working as of now. We have an extension that is not yet in the paper, in which banks have both retail deposits for which the pass-through is less than 1, and wholesale debt for which the pass-through is more 1-to-1. We still don't have the results, but what I would anticipate would happen is that you might have that if the amount of deposits is high enough, you have an increase in the net interest margin rather than a decrease as we have now. So then this amplification mechanism would reverse and become dampening for these banks. So this is something that we also want to explore, whether there's a third dimension of heterogeneity, which is proportion of deposit funding as opposed to wholesale or other type of debt, and what are the implications of this. So, I mean, at the risk of trying to do too much in one paper, I think having this third degree of heterogeneity is relevant for the empirical responses, and this is something that we want to do. So, yeah.
Any more questions? Please.
Hi. I'm wondering whether you have data about interest rate hedging by these banks in the derivative market, because no matter they use fixed or floating rate, both in the deposit and the lower market. In the end, they can do asset and liability management and hedges in the derivative markets. So this would make your data more noisy, right?
Yeah, no, this is a very good point, and has come up in previous presentations. Something that people have in mind. Banks do have the option to hedge either via interest rate derivatives or other means. We don't have the data ourselves, but we do rely on other papers that both for the US and for Europe have looked at banks' use of interest rate derivatives for hedging. What they typically find is that there's no perfect hedging of interest rate risk. So in that sense, we argue that what we have in the model might be extreme case in which there's no hedging at all, but we do, I mean, people have seen in the data that both at the aggregate level at individual banks do not perfectly hedge interest rate risk. So we rely on that result from others papers to just assume banks in our model do not hedge. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. No? Well, I'd like to thank you again for the presenters. The presenters and for the high quality and of the papers, and we invite invite the audience and to lunch that's served in the hall. Thank you.
Some of the comments seem like you read our minds. This is not